Good evening, everyone. Lovely that you're there. Thank you for joining. It's part 2 of Kryptopyrroluria and its mysteries. And I'll now go to my slides and open them up. So now I'll open up the full view. And I will be talking for about 45 minutes. And so at the end, we'll have time for questions. So do please pop any that occur to you while we're going through, or any comments in the chat or the Q&A. So the Mysteries of Kryptopyrroluria, part 2. So the first point, or the first topic, is just a brief recap on what Kryptopyrroluria is for anybody who wasn't here last time, though I would suggest that you please do look at the part 1 of this, because there's lots more detail there. So what the word Kryptopyrroluria means is, crypto stands for hidden or invisible. Pyrrole is a substance involved in the formation of heme. And I'm spelling that the American way here because most of the articles that I cite are from American journals, but of course in English that would have an A in it, H-A-E-M. Urea means excreted in the urine. So this basically means an invisible or hidden substance that is being excreted in the urine. And different terms have been used over the years. I've got them all listed there. If you're doing a web search for it, often the best, interestingly, is pyrroluria with just one R. Now, the discovery of this, which was originally called the mauve factor, was in the early 1960s when 3 doctors were doing studies of psychiatric patients. That was Dr. Hoffer, Irvin, and Dr. Pfeiffer. And they found a mauve color in the urine of their patients on the chromatograms they were using. And what Dr. Pfeiffer found was that a considerable percentage of patients who had the label schizophrenia were actually suffering from an excess of this mauve factor in their urine. And it was originally termed by this group cryptopyrroles. And he said in a book that he wrote that included large sections on this, called Nutrition and Mental Illness, that approximately 15 to 30% of schizophrenics were found to have pyrroluria. And what happens in pyrroluria, or KPU as I'll call it, is that as these cryptopyrroles are excreted in the urine, they pull out the vitamin B6 and zinc in most cases. I mean, it can vary, but in most cases, it's B6 and zinc that the patient is literally peeing out. This is a quotation by Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt, who has studied this in great detail and actually given an excellent webinar on this, which I'll link to more fully in a moment. But he has said you're quite literally peeing out an improperly synthesized heme molecule. So this is from the laboratory that we actually use in Germany. This is a chemical, a set of chemical formulas from their report, and it's described in greater detail here and in the report how that's taking place. So what are pyrroles? They are the scaffolding of heme, and heme is actually a molecule that is found in every cell of the body, every single cell. It's incredible, really, because it's needed for forming ATP. That's our energy currency, adenosine triphosphate. So it's inside every electron transport chain inside the mitochondria. So that's most cells in the body except for the erythrocytes. That's our red blood cells. And of course, the red blood cells also have heme in hemoglobin. So there's no cell in the body that doesn't need heme. And if you're losing the scaffolding of your heme because you have KPU, then that's pretty serious. And one typical red blood cell contains about 270 million hemoglobin molecules. Each of those carry 4 heme groups, and each of those have 4 pyrroles. So you can imagine what sorts of numbers we're talking about here. That's just in one red blood cell. We're talking about literally billions of these pyrroles. So what this condition can cause if, for whatever reason, and we will go into the reasons further in this presentation, but if you are unable to keep that scaffolding of your heme in place, I'll just show you again briefly on the previous slide. Here is one molecule of pyrrole, and you can see here 2, 3, 4. That's around the heme molecule. Inside you have iron, and this is heme itself. So heme is composed of many, many hemoglobins, 270 million. Unbelievable, isn't it? And around each little heme structure, you have these pyrroles, literally holding it in place. So what can happen if somebody's suffering from KPU? Well, there are many, many different symptoms that can occur. These are just the first 3 out of, I think, about 10 pages that I mentioned in the first presentation. So the physical appearance may reflect that because of the lack of oxygenation, because obviously if you can't carry heme around the body, you're going to become hypoxic. This means a degree of anemia. The oxygen isn't being carried. So the person may have pale, sallow skin, pale lips. They may suffer from light intolerance, which is a symptom of the mitochondria not working properly, which is again going to happen if you don't have enough oxygen in your body. And dark rings around the eyes may reflect the effort that the kidneys are having to make to excrete all of these pyrroles that normally come out in the stool. And if you have pyrroluria, they're coming out in the urine, and that's not a good thing for the kidneys to be working so hard. Impaired energy production is a given because, of course, you're not getting oxygen into your mitochondria to burn it there properly. Why not? Because the red blood cells aren't carrying enough oxygen. Why not? Because the heme isn't working properly. Yeah, these little scaffoldings are just breaking down and then taking out various nutrients from your body that you should basically be getting in sufficient quantities. Well, instead you're losing them. And the detoxification issues are because cytochrome P450 oxygenase, that contains heme, and that can't work properly without it. So environmental toxins will build up as a result, and multiple chemical sensitivity is one side effect of this. Intolerances of different kinds can occur as well. So please see part 1 for further details on all the different issues that can arise. Dr. Klinghardt gave a really very detailed presentation on this, which I've linked to at the bottom of the page. There you have the YouTube link, back in 2010. And he was talking to a group of practitioners and parents who'd come together on autism specifically. And he was talking about Lyme-induced autism. And so he said here, I suspect that more than 80% of kids have this condition and should be treated for it properly. Now, here he was talking about the children that he sees with autism. It's not all children. And this is an extensive article on KPU that Dr. Klinghardt and Scott Forsgren wrote together in the Townsend newsletter. I mean, there are many, many other articles, of course, which, I can send you an entire list of. They are on our website as well about KPU. But this one was, particularly interesting because it has a lot of detail about potential therapies in it as well, linked to at the bottom of the page. And there he writes that he found the incidence of KPU in Lyme disease to be 80% or higher. So because we're talking about heme, we have to think about the mitochondria, because that's where 4 key steps in the synthesis of heme take place. As you will know, our mitochondria are little organelles inside our cells, and sometimes we have thousands of them in one cell. This is the lovely thing about this particular image here from a film called Powering the Cell, put together by some Harvard professors. They wanted to emphasize with these images how many mitochondria you have in one cell, and not just 2 or 3 like in the medical textbooks. So the first enzyme that synthesizes heme is here in green at the top of the page, aminolevulinic acid synthase. And this green rectangle represents the mitochondria. And so if that's not working properly, then you won't be able to synthesize heme from the get-go. There are 3 others that take place inside the mitochondria. You can see them in green here, and I'll be talking a bit more about ferrochelatase, the last one, because it has been postulated by good scientists, particularly in the German literature on this, because there's very little English literature on it, in fact, that ferrochelatase is often faulty and is unable to properly formulate heme, and I'll talk about why that might be a bit later. Anyway, interestingly, for aminolevulinic acid synthase, you need B6. So you can see how this can very quickly become a self-perpetuating vicious cycle, because if you don't have enough B6 because you have KPU, then it's going to begin to affect other mitochondria, because the ALA, aminolevulinic acid here, has to be formed from this enzyme that requires B6. So lack of B6 is going to begin to have a knock-on effect throughout your cells. So going on to the next page, it can be primary or secondary. So it can be found in families because somebody had it genetically and then it was inherited. So that means you're overproducing pyrroles. That has been found as a condition that is termed a primary condition, but you can also acquire it in life, and that's called a secondary form. That's acquired KPU. And it can be acquired due to huge stress, due to mitochondrial dysfunction. You can see the logic of that in what we've just discussed, in lack of certain nutrients that help you to form these enzymes that we've just looked at. We'll talk about that in a little while. And stress is particularly important. Of course, stress has a physiological effect as well. It has a knock-on effect in the body and causes physiological change. In the webinar of Dr. Klinghart's, if you read that or listen to that, you'll see that he does stress, because he has this 5 levels of healing where the mental and emotional and even spiritual side are incorporated in healing. And he does talk there a lot about how trauma can also impact on the cells and eventually cause this condition too. So I don't think that's been proven, as it were in science yet. You know, there aren't sort of peer-reviewed studies of that, but it's very, very logical, isn't it? And another thing, interestingly, that he says in that, but I haven't gone into here, I'm saying this because people asked last time, what makes it happen? You know, what causes it? He does there also say that a Borrelia, because that's the causative agent of Lyme disease, he suspects, and he sees in his patient cohorts, appears to have very clever mechanisms of downregulating a patient's immune system. And we do know that that happens. For example, Th1, which is the intracellular immunity, does get suppressed in patients with Lyme disease and co-infections. But he suspects that it's very, very cleverly downregulating a patient's zinc, so that all the enzymes needed for your immunity that rely on zinc become dysfunctional. And that allows the Borrelia, that's the agent of Lyme, that allows it to continue surviving. So he says in that lecture, if you listen to it, he says 20 years ago, 2010, I'm probably not calculating it correctly, it's more like 25, 10, 20, no, more like 15 years. But he says he reckons that will be proven in the future in studies. So therapists do find it more commonly in women and children than in males. And Carl Pfeiffer, who discovered it originally, estimated that more than 10% of the population is affected by it. So testing is possible in urine, and it's very important to protect this well because it's light sensitive, heat sensitive, and oxygen sensitive, these pyrroles, which can dissipate very quickly, this mauve factor. So please, if you do the test, do it in the dark as well as you can, and put it very quickly into the tube, which has a stabilizer in it, which then protects it, and put it into the fridge and keep it in the dark. Make sure that it's collected on the same day. One of the problems that, again, Dr. Klinghardt explains to us even now, is that if labs batch the tests and only do them once they have enough, then by that time the cryptopyrroles can have dissipated or certainly be lower than they really should be on testing. So we say when we send it to Germany, it's not BioVis that we do it at. We found a very, very good laboratory after searching for a long time. We wanted a distinctive one with a good track record, and it's called Kiveno. We do it there. Immune Diagnostic is the name of the sort of mother company, and they do not batch it. They do it immediately. They receive the test, and so it needs to get there quickly. So we do have to send it by courier. He says, Dr. Klinghardt, that we don't write this in our instructions. It's best to come off any supplements you're on that could be masking the condition for about 5 days beforehand. That does make sense, like B6 and zinc and manganese, but some patients are reliant on their supplement protocols, so we can't really tell patients they must. You decide that together with your therapist. So this is the test, and it is measured in nanograms per milliliter, and this would be a positive one because over 150 is positive. It's a 7-page test, so it's really, very extensive and I think useful. And we try to keep the cost down, so it's below £100. I think here we had the form, and call AONM if you're interested in doing it, or just click on this page and all the instructions are there. It's nice because you can at least do it at home. There's no need for a blood draw. So therapies, that's what we wanted to concentrate on this time. Of course, the first thing you'll usually read on web pages and when you start looking into it is to start eating more foods that contain the nutrients that you're likely to be peeing out, in quotation marks, as we saw earlier. So that would be B6, zinc, sometimes manganese, sometimes not. So I'll talk about that in a moment. And of course, others. Biotin is one that has been found to be depleted, chromium, magnesium, omega-6 particularly. I know that a lot of the therapists here will be thinking, well, let's test these in our patients. Let's just see whether they're depleted in them. The problem is it's very hard to test the intracellular and intramitochondrial levels of all of these. And the big summit that we had with Dr. Klinghardt just a few weeks ago, there he did stress related to many of the different topics he was talking about, how very, very difficult it is to test the real sort of intracellular levels of these nutrients and to be sure that you're really picking up the level, especially with something like B6, which can shift from one form to another so quickly. So manganese, the reason why a lot of sources will say be a bit careful about that is because Lyme does live off manganese. Borrelia uses that as its fuel rather than iron, as most bacteria do. And so if it's a patient that concurrently has Lyme disease, then you don't want to necessarily be giving them a supplement with a lot of manganese in it, or giving them lots of foods with manganese, certainly for the first few months. So that's something, again, to discuss with your therapist and work out. But anyway, you can't really take supraphysiological doses of these foods to get enough of what you're losing. I mean, the trillions and trillions of cells that you have in your body, each of them potentially losing vital nutrients. You're not going to get enough in without taking lots and lots of carbohydrates and eating a really huge number of these foods, huge amounts of these foods. So that's why taking targeted nutrients can be, when I say nutrients, nutraceuticals and herbs can be very useful. You also don't want to be overdosing on carbohydrates, as you all know. It can be a lot more sensible to up your fats and your ketones for your mitochondria to the extent that your mitochondria can actually use them. This is something that can be tested, but large numbers of carbohydrates just encourage the non-mitochondrial fuel delivery systems of your body. That's called glycolysis. That takes place outside the mitochondria. So that's not something you want to fuel with a lot of glucose going into your body, whether that's vegetables and fruits or not. So various KPU combinations of remedies have been formulated. This is just a selection of them worldwide, whether from Australia, like this one here, Natrovital, or from Germany, this Biogena one. This Cryptobalance is also from Germany. You can sort of get the impression of what it's for from the name. And these ones are from Key Science, which is Dr. Klinghart's formulary here in Brighton in the UK. Key Core has a selection of nutrients. As long as your patient can take a combination, that's useful. It's there are ways of checking these things that and you may have a patient who can only take one nutrient at a time to test whether they're tolerant to it or not. So then you might choose something else. These are all combinations. And Key Core S, the S stands for sine, which means without in Latin, and it's without manganese. So this would be for a patient who also has Lyme disease, where you want to not overdose them with manganese. The advice for the Klinghart sort of practitioners is to give that for 3 months in that case, and then to move over to a remedy that might have it, because you don't want to deprive the body of that forever either. So the bioflavonoid quercetin acts as an ionophore, as it's called. That enables the zinc to get into the cells better. That is something that's been especially emphasized over the course of COVID, the last 4 years. Doctors and other therapists, discovered how useful that was to actually ferry zinc into the cell. And this on the right is just one of, many descriptions of how that can happen. Sophora japonica is high in quercetin, and quite a lot of the herbs that are labeled quercetin are derived from Sophora japonica. This is an example of that tree with the lovely, herbs that it's or fruits that it's able to carry. And broccoli also contains that, by the way. So broccoli powders, if it's especially from broccoli sprouts, that contains 100 times more concentrated quercetin and other nutrients than broccoli itself. So this is just another slide showing other symptoms that the patient who is suffering from KPU may have. Not every patient will have every symptom, of course, so it does need a really good workup to find out what you need to replace and support. But neurological issues are, as we've seen in the Carl Pfeiffer beginning that we looked at, the origins of this, neurological issues can definitely be driven by KPU. And this is because so many of the neurotransmitters require B6 and zinc. So you may need neurological support, and that may even include a few other nutrients that we haven't yet mentioned. We'll talk about them. Interestingly, animal experiments have shown that injecting rats, cats, and guinea pigs with free pyrroles leads to severe neurological disorders, and I've given you the link to that at the bottom of the page. Hyperactivity, including pandas, worth considering whether KPU is involved. When I say pandas, that's autoimmune neuropsychiatric syndromes that are driven by an infection, but Kryptopyrroluria can be a concomitant of that. Thyroid disorders, because you need zinc for the thyroid as well as many of the other nutrients that we've already mentioned, and of course you need oxygen. The mitochondria need to be working for the thyroid to work, and you do need heme, interestingly, to trigger free T3. And so if that's not working, then thyroid support, or let's put it this way, if the patient has KPU, do a thyroid panel, work out where you are with the thyroid. Immune disorders are possible too, because after all, our immune cells are made of for antibodies, you need amino acids, and the amino acids are formed from what you manage to break down in your stomach, among other things. And HCl in the stomach is B6 dependent, together with other nutrients that are required. But without B6, you're not going to be able to break down protein to form amino acids as well as you should in your digestive system. And that can lead to suppressed antibodies, and it's antibodies that are partially involved in your immune system. So you may need to give your patient immune support as well. This is all about what's called the sort of minimum effective dose, is what doctors talk about when they're considering giving their patients medications. And I think we in supplementation and support with herbs should also be thinking along those lines. What's the minimum that we can give patients in order to support them? And we don't want to be giving them sort of bag loads of supplements. So this does take a good think through, good sorting and testing too sometimes. So what can occur if you have KPU is a breakdown of the tryptophan pathway, which forms your serotonin, again, because it's B6 and zinc reliant. And if that's happening, then you're not going to have this happy hormone serotonin that is really absolutely essential for good neurotransmitter balance, because the precursor of serotonin is the amino acid L-tryptophan. Interestingly, that is one of the aromatic amino acids that is actually involved in a particular pathway that is affected by glyphosate as well, which is the most common herbicide in the world in Roundup. And so another reason, of course, we know that ideally we'd be eating organic and prescribing organic to our patients as well. It's often considered to be too expensive and difficult, but actually for a patient already suffering with KPU, eating organic and not having that glyphosate problem on top of everything else, which makes it difficult for you to break down your precursors into the aromatic amino acids, tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine, is really important. And then, of course, later in the pathway, serotonin. So B3 can be helpful for that, niacin, and also GABA, because that's another breakdown product that's essential for your neurotransmitters. It's actually the calming neurotransmitter, and you can't make that without B6 and zinc, because L-glutamine has to be broken down using those cofactors. And so you may also lack that, and that can lead to hyperactivity, because L-glutamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. So that's not That's something you do often see, especially in children, I suppose, who are suffering from this. You do pick up the hyperactivity in them. So this is almost something that will come before everything we've just discussed, which is that if you're going to put zinc back into the enzymes that were lacking it, what will have happened is that they take up other metals to just keep going. The body is, in its intelligence, just, going to pick up whatever it can find in order to power those enzymes, albeit suboptimally. And it is known that the most likely metals that it will put in the place of zinc, if you're very, very low on zinc because of KPU, are cadmium, lead, aluminium, and mercury. So when you start resubstituting zinc, these heavy metals will be knocked off, and the KPU sufferer can really begin to notice sort of what's often called a Herx reaction, but it's a toxicity reaction from needing to excrete these metals, even if it seems to be in small amounts. It's actually, unusual and disturbing for the body to have these coming out, particularly if the first port of call is to excrete them via the urine. That's not advisable, because the nephrons, once they're impacted by something like a heavy metal that's going through at a higher rate of knots than it should, they don't get replaced, whereas the gut cells, the cells of the gastrointestinal tract, are replaced every 3 days. So it's a lot better if you can excrete these heavy metals via your stool. So that's the reason for the advice to take a binder. And so I'll be talking about the binders, which you should really begin before anything else, at least 5 days beforehand, in a moment. And a binder ensures that the heavy metals and other contaminants come out of the body via the stool and don't either put too high a pressure on the kidneys or recirculate back into the body via what's called the enterohepatic recirculation. So to support the kidneys, which are already doing such a heavy job, there are various herbal nutrients you can use, like parsley, interestingly. That is impressive with its health benefits. I've linked to an article here that you can read on it. Petroselinum is another form of parsley called Italian giant parsley. You can get that as well. Juniper, horsetail, they have particularly good track records for helping to support the kidneys. Hydrangea too. And wild garlic, also called bear garlic. That is pictured here. And this is a little bit of a sort of text on that you can read if you wish to. The binders that I have particular contact with are chlorella and zeolite. Whether you use chlorella vulgaris or chlorella pyrrhunoidosa depends on what else you're looking at in your patient. Pyrrhunoidosa is a stronger binder really for heavy metals, whereas vulgaris has scientific evidence now of being able to pull out the spike protein as well. So if you're talking about long COVID, that might be the one to choose. And then you're sort of combining the two actions. Zeolite, again, very important to check that you've got a really good form of that. Not pleased to use the liquid form, because the aluminium in zeolite can easily dissociate from the silica in that, and increase your heavy metal load. By all accounts, again, I'm sort of using Dr. Klinghart's wisdom here, because he's talked about that a lot. So have a look at what type of zeolite you're getting, and just check the source of that and make sure that it's not nanonized or liquefied. And then modified citrus pectin is something that's also known to be a good binder. I've got some evidence for that in a moment. And then you may want to just check how much fiber your patient is consuming or able to consume. Depends a bit on various gut issues, whether they have IBS, IBD, but soluble and insoluble fiber should ideally be a lot higher than what we're having in our diets these days. Going on to sources for chlorella and its metal binding capacity, here are a few, and there are many others. Salvia, that's sage. Sclarea and officinalis are the best ones to use for cadmium. Work with a herbalist, please, if you're going to use these. The herbalist will be able to give you the best advice on this, but I've included a few sources here after talking to a herbalist about her recommendations. And melatonin can help prevent cadmium-induced toxicity. I know we're not allowed to prescribe that in this country. Only doctors can, and only 2, I think, milligrams per day in circadin. But that's something for you to discuss perhaps with your patients outside of the UK. I know we have foreign listeners here as well. So the alginates, that's the modified citrus pectin, are able to trap certain metal ions in a particular egg box structure here that's described in this article. That's really very fascinating. And you can see here the lead, the mercury, and the cadmium being captured and then excreted. So that's something to maybe read up on as a therapist if you don't yet use that. Coriander is very useful for getting mercury out of the body. Just be careful if the patient still has amalgam fillings, then you don't want to use it until the amalgams, which are 50% mercury, are out of the mouth. And so I've got here a combination remedy that actually is made by Key Science. That's one I particularly like, called Coriandolo. And for aluminium, there are combination remedies you can use that contain horsetail and other types of herb. So additionally, you may wish to give your patient magnesium, especially if they're suffering from constipation as well. But magnesium sulfate is nicely absorbed in an Epsom salt bath. If they can tolerate sulfates, I mean, some patients have difficulty with that. Though if you've got over your KPU, there are patients who suddenly become very sulfate tolerant again. So that's interesting. Taurine for the bile, magnesium malate maybe for the mitochondria. Your patient may be excreting calcium as well and have a need for that, though I'd prefer to see that supplemented in food form rather than as a supplement. And you may wish to give your patient glutathione precursors too for their intracellular antioxidants. The right form of electrolytes too is a good idea, depending on the kinds of foods that your patient is actually digesting and able to break down. You may at the beginning want to supplement with a trace mineral mix. Omega-6s also get depleted in many patients with KPU. This is something that's often not sufficiently recognized, is how important the good, pure omega-6s are. Evening primrose oil, borage oil, or blackcurrant oil if you're going to supplement them. Of course, there are many foods that contain them, but again, what quantities of foods do you need to consume in order to get sufficient levels? It may be a patient who appears initially to be a bit fat intolerant, but the ratio of 4:1 omega-6s to omega-3s does appear to have very good scientific backing. This is just one of many articles. This is by Shlomo Yehuda. And following this article, many, many more have been written arguing that, this ratio is sensible and not necessarily such a high level of omega-3s as one often sees being recommended to patients. But again, I'm just emphasizing it varies so much from one patient to another and what else is going on. But for KPU, please do consider the omega-6s. EMF protection is essential anyway. for every patient really, because our cells are so sensitive and not really, the voltage gradient in our cells is electrical. The electron transport chain inside our mitochondria does what it says on the box. It transports electrons, and Wi-Fi disrupts the voltage-gated calcium channels of our cells, meaning that the voltage gates on these cells don't work like they should. They allow other things to flow in, like calcium, that shouldn't. They get blocked up and stop working properly. So do please switch off your router at night, your phones if you can, unless you have some sort of emergency going on. But otherwise, it's a very good idea to protect your brain, at least at night, from Wi-Fi. And I've mentioned here some internal and external protections that you can consider. And so one thing I wanted to really, really emphasize is how important it does appear to be to consider bioavailable copper. Now, the reason for this is quite complex. And I've only recently, that's over the last 2.5 to 3 years, learnt about this in greater detail than I knew before via the root cause protocol, which I've been studying, and also the German literature that I've been reading in preparation for this over the last few months does actually emphasize how important ferrochelatase is as the final enzyme that's necessary to form heme, and how that is reliant on copper, bioavailable copper. Without that, it can't work, and how difficult it is actually for us to have sufficient levels of bioavailable copper for all our cells to be getting the heme that we need. So 4 of these enzymes, all these 4 are copper dependent. I'll just show you evidence for that one there, ferrochelatase, from Bruce Ames, Dr. Ames, a brilliant microbiologist, chemist, professor, in fact, at the University of California, who's only just passed away, over 90. And he, together with his team, wrote many articles about this, including this one right in the abstract. And this was back in 2005. Today, we know that copper stimulates the activity of ferrochelatase. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about here. And without that, you're not going to get your heme made. And that, we have seen, is a big part of what KPU is about. So as I've written here, ferrochelatase requires copper as a cofactor. Is this perhaps a huge missing piece of the puzzle in the pyrroluria mystery? Now, last month, the most important magazine in England called, for integrative healthcare, called ICAN, the Integrative Healthcare and Applied Nutrition magazine, actually had a cover story, and this was its cover: copper, the ultimate mitochondrial nutrient. And they will be covering that more. So this is something that's becoming more and more evident, even though, it was discovered decades ago, really. But it hasn't been highlighted in the teaching, and certainly I think in medical school it's also not really up there as a priority topic. But look at this, for example, role of copper on mitochondrial function and metabolism. So if you want to increase the copper in your cells, the bioavailable copper, this is not just any copper that you can pick off your local health food shelf, because there are different forms of it. But retinol, which is the real form of vitamin A, is essential for that. Without retinol, you can't get bioavailable copper into the cell, because, and this is, part of the complexity of this, though there is a simplicity at the other end, ceruloplasmin is needed to it carries the copper into the cell and the mitochondria. And without retinol, you can't build your ceruloplasmin so well. So ceruloplasmin is barely ever measured, even though it's easy to measure. Your GPs can measure that. And I usually find that low in patients now that I am measuring it. So interestingly, again here, studies have shown that adding iron does not meaningfully restore normal hemoglobin levels, but vitamin A does. Isn't that fascinating? So natural sources of bioavailable copper are listed here. I won't go through them all, but I'm sure you know a lot of them anyway as therapists, most of you. And because mitochondrial dysfunction is such a large part of the puzzle, just to mention that we do mitochondrial tests as well. And I think this is the only lab in Europe available that does do mitochondrial tests. So we're very, very pleased to be able to do them here. And if you've got an ATP profile, for example, that's low on glycolytic ATP capacity, then glycolysis, you'll remember that's what produces energy outside the mitochondria using glucose. That may not be getting into the mitochondria, which is this big, yellow section here, this rectangle. It might not be getting in because the pyruvic acid can't get through the doorway because it lacks certain nutrients. So all of this, and I know it's looking a little bit complicated. It looks like there are lots and lots of nutrients that you might need. This is why testing can be so helpful, to exclude the ones that you don't need so that you're not taking a bucket load of things. But these are all additional things that are covered in what I'm going to mention now. These are all mentioned in the webinar that we did just a couple of weeks ago called The Mitochondria and Chronic Health Conditions. So just click on that and watch that if you think that the mitochondrial dysfunction piece could be the most important, because I've talked really about three different groupings here. I've talked about the traditional way of approaching KPU, which is to supply the nutrients that you're peeing out. I've talked about what could be an underlying condition that's perhaps driving it, certainly in the acquired conditions, not so much the genetic ones, of sorry, I've got to the end of my 45 minutes now, of looking at whether your cells are lacking certain enzymatic components that are preventing them from being able to build that those pyrroles and that heme. That's the retinol ceruloplasmin copper pathway. And I've mentioned as a third thing to look at the mitochondrial dysfunction that could be a deep underlying issue as well. So just to mention on the previous page that unfortunately the spike protein and the viral RNA from COVID do localize to the mitochondria, and many, many articles now, literally thousands, evidencing that, and literally switching off the mitochondria sometimes, not all of them, of course, certain parts of the body, certain, groupings of them. And so do consider that, spike clearance might be part of the issue as well. Well, part of the solution. So lots to cover there, really. I hope that was at least a smattering of sort of ideas. We do have a mitochondrial webinar series, so lots of lovely webinars to look at there. We also have part one, if you haven't yet watched that, on KPU specifically. We do have articles in our blog about the link between KPU and mitochondrial disorders, as well as in our newsletters. And we have been covering articles on the mitochondria right from the beginning of when we started publishing newsletters. That was in 2014. So do have a look at our website. It's under information. All our newsletters are there. So thanks very, very much. And I'll just stop sharing now and have a look and see what we have in the chat. So because I don't have somebody actually asking me the questions today, I'll just have to scroll back and see them. Sue is asking, when was part one? Trying to find it as I missed part one. That's on the AONM.org website under Kryptopyrroluria, or I think it's abbreviated KPU webinars. Oh, somebody has kindly put in the link there. Thank you. And so you will be provided with the slides afterwards. We're going to put up the slides and the recording. And will supplementation compensate sufficiently for the increased urinary excretion? Well, Elizabeth, that is something to check. I have seen people with that, for example, key core remedy being prescribed 10 of them where it says on the box 2 a day. So that was using ART, I think. That might have been Dr. Klinghardt. So obviously you do need to have a sort of therapeutic context for that if you're going to prescribe a very high dose of B6, which on the sort of box will say that it can cause neurological disorders if you take above 25 milligrams. So you have to be sort of sure in what you're doing, though there are very good sources saying that's just not true. You can go a lot higher than that. But you do need to be careful in the balance. Again, you don't want to take one bee without having all of the bees there to support that in general. And also taking too much zinc for too long will displace your iron and your copper. So you can see the kinds of, contradictions we're going to be getting into here. So it's worth really thinking through whether you want to supplement those nutrients for a long, long time, or whether there are ways of, checking every 4 to 6 weeks how your patient is doing, and perhaps adjusting the supplements you're giving them according to how they're doing, maybe retesting. I'm not saying every 4 to 6 weeks, maybe every 3 months or 6 months, retesting the KPU, the mitochondria, but hopefully the patients are already feeling better. And the difference with PANS would be the timing of onset of symptoms, right? Clara asks. PANS and PANDAS, that's pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric syndrome. And the PANDAS is the one with streptococcal driving it. And it doesn't have to be pediatric. Obviously adults can get that too, not just children. But there's so much more relating to that I would suggest having a look at our website, where we do have a PANS PANDAS webpage, and having a look at the information there, because I would say we have to be careful about associating KPU entirely with PANS PANDAS, though in children with autism type symptoms who sort of come for consultations and then end up being diagnosed with this and being sort of supported in overcoming this at the beginning. Yes, I do see a lot of that, but not exclusively. So I think you have to look at the other symptoms related to PANS PANDAS too, because that's such a huge topic. We do, by the way, have a PANS PANDAS discussion group taking place on the 4th of December at 6 o'clock. So if you're interested in that, please do write to me, because that's a sort of invitation only thing. We're not sort of writing to our entire circulation list about that, because it is a very specific interest. But we also have a professional training on PANS PANDAS next week, and Claire will put the date of that into the chat, please. I think it's next Wednesday. That begins at 6 as well. So that may be something, Claire, if you'd like to take part in that, where we can discuss this a bit more. Joan has asked, in somebody with KPU who needs more zinc, could supplementation with higher amounts promote a deficiency of another mineral? Well, yes, unfortunately, of copper, which we've just mentioned earlier, of iron, absolutely. Please don't take multi-minerals that contain all of these. Often you'll take a sort of multi-vit, multi-mineral that will contain zinc and copper and iron, and that's really not a good idea. I mean, if you have to take all of them or 2 of them, then take them at different times of the day, but not all together in one. You'll just be sort of torpedoing what you're trying to do. I'm trying to scroll down and not doing that very well. Here we are. Afifa says, and glycine. Yes, absolutely. Glycine is actually displaced by glyphosate, and giving your patients glycine can take the place of glyphosate and help them to overcome the literally glyphosate toxicity they may be suffering from. Best herb to help the kidneys is Parietaria diffusa. Lovely. You're a medical herbalist, Hafifa. Thank you for letting us know that. Well, maybe we can have you tell us more about that another time. Thank you. Can we get the slides for part 1? They're down next to the recording on the website under Kryptopyrroluria webinars. The slides are there. What's the best way of measuring copper? Hair, blood, urine? It's very difficult, Marina, to measure intracellular and intramitochondrial copper. The advice is often to actually use ceruloplasmin, and if that's on the lower end of the scale or low, because that carries at least 4 bioavailable coppers into the cell. If that's low, then you're not getting it in. So that's a very good measure to use. And otherwise, if you have it high in serum, which is where it's mostly measured, then it's often said to be high level toxic, get it out of everything that the patient's taking. But that's incorrect. High serum copper generally means that it's low inside the cells. So it is very difficult to measure. But if you've got urine, copper, of course, you know, that'll be that you're peeing it out. So I think that needs to be looked at together with other markers, particularly a good iron panel that contains ferritin and transferrin and so on, because it's the copper iron balance that you're looking at particularly. Recommend a private lab? No, not specifically for copper. I'm sorry, though. You know, there are good hair tests that can be done. Do copper water pipes in the UK guard against copper deficiency to some extent? I sort of, I'm not a specialist on that, so I can't say, but I doubt whether the copper that you're literally getting from copper water pipes is going to be the kind of bioavailable copper that you want to be getting, the particularly copper bisglycinate. There is a good copper that's made together with beef liver, which I know the vegans and vegetarians won't really want, but it contains curcumin and spirulina. That's a very, very nice one that you can get in the UK. I was told previously that copper was to be avoided with KPU. Well, that's Gail Sumner, the Walsh approach, which is, I mean, I haven't studied the Walsh approach in great detail, though I have been to his talks and I have read some of his work. But what I've learned through the root cause protocol and through reading a lot of studies, I can send you entire lists of this, you know, references backing this up, is that that is the serum copper that's found to be high, but that is an indication that it's not actually in the cells, it's not inside the mitochondria. So that I don't want to sort of malign anybody by, you know, talking against a brilliant Walsh practitioner, but certainly what I've learned is the importance of copper, even for complex 4 of the electron transport chain. That doesn't work without heme, and the heme in that is not going to work without copper. Absolutely fascinating. So lots more on that can be found from the links that I've put into my presentation. So it's not that it's now thought that copper is fine to take for these patients. It's this sort of pathway that needs to be thought through. On the slides there above, oh, I see. I can see, Claire. Thank you for putting that in. I'm just scrolling down to see if there are any other questions. Thanks very much for your comments. That's really kind. Lovely to see you, Vemi, there as well. We met at the mitochondrial, the NMI mitochondrial webinar, not webinars, event that was held just recently, 2 days of brilliant information on the mitochondria, which has backed up a lot of what I'm saying here as well. So many companies are promoting nanozeolite as being the best. Yes, there, do listen to, you know, and go back over the webinars of Dr. Klinghart's if you want further information on that. He has also talked about that at AONM webinars, and I say webinars all the time. It was actually a conference. And Claire, I don't know if you're able to pull out the event at which Dr. Klinghart spoke in person for us. I think it was in 2019, but there he actually said from the stage how problematic that is and explained why. Any genetic SNPs to be considered with pyrroluria? Certainly, if you've got a methylation issue, then that will contribute. And if you've got problems along the CBS pathway, then that will mean that you've got difficulties with glutathione, and you may not be able to take glutathione initially, or at least tolerate it, and sulfur products because of that particular, the properties of the breakdown into sulfur that's needed along the CBS pathways. So I'd need to leave that to genetic specialists. I can't claim to be one, but yes, absolutely. And we even talked about the urea cycle and the SNPs in that can contribute to problems with nitric oxide synthase. And that's mentioned in the first webinar of mine. I did talk about Amy Yasko, Dr. Yasko, who's done huge work on the genetics of this. And when I say of this, not necessarily of KPU, but on genetics, talking about methylation and how important that is. So I think we're probably running out of time. I don't have the time up on my computer, which is silly. Yeah, we are already after 8 o'clock. So I can't say that I'll be able to answer all of the questions, but I know we're going to copy them over and keep them for another time, if that's all right. Somebody's put in a link. Do copy over the chat as well if you'd like to. I think it's possible to copy over the chat. It's not a sort of locked chat. And somebody's written here that Ray copper glutathione plays a role. Absolutely. And people have put in the link to Dr. Klinghart's presentation as well. So thank you very much for being there. Lovely to have seen you all. I don't think we have any more webinars this year, but we will have more, of course, beginning as of January. We're going to have part 2 of our mitochondrial remedies for chronic conditions and lots of others, including, of course, our tried and tested sort of Lyme, Armin Labs, Professor Schwarzbach presentations. So please do come back to our events page and have a look at what's going on, and hopefully you'll receive our e-blasts about that as well. Wishing everybody a very wonderful sort of seasonal break, and thank you again for being there this evening. Bye-bye.